Hello and welcome to the War Elephant Podcast Editor's Pick, Episode 8. I'm your host, Ian. I have with me my co-host.
Hi, I'm Christine.
Today we're going to talk briefly about some war robots, move on to the very complicated and hopefully thoughtful discussion of feminism, and then end with a very brief note on the election tomorrow. So let's get started with our talking about the war robots. We had an article posted on the War Elephant website, which you can visit currently at Quora, about the robotic combat vehicle, which may accompany army units into battle, and it's pretty cool looking. The vehicle is basically either remote or self-driving tank. But of course, there are many different kinds of robotic vehicles that are being used in military combat today, mostly in support or dangerous insertion or attack. The most famous, of course, are the airborne drones that launch missiles. There are, of course, many questions about how these things will affect warfare, whether they will detach our citizenry and our military forces from the costs of warfare, and what that means in terms of the ethics and the willingness of countries to go to war with only money on the line rather than human lives. So this is both exciting and definitely something to be thoughtful about. I think that it definitely excites me as a fan of science fiction, and the idea of robots fighting each other is not necessarily my biggest thing. I've never been a Transformers fan, but I do understand the appeal of these things. So what do you think about war robots, Christine?
Well, it's a pretty exciting new territory. It has the potential to reduce the human cost, but then again, every time technology jumps forward, we seem to find new ways to increase the human cost as well. It bears to keep in mind that places all over the world are littered with things like landmines, and the destructive force of even TNT is well known. Somehow we managed to find ways to make our war toys extremely destructive, and they won't stay only in the United States' hands all that long. So that's a little sobering, but that's hardly a reason for us to eschew them. Whatever we don't use, the technology will get used by other people, which means the technology is here, it will get used. I think they are pretty neat. I know that it's an interesting area for a lot of people to go study, and it might attract new people who really weren't all that interested in being soldiers into going into the military with lucrative new careers, which will translate well into civilian roles in the future. There are some interesting other robots which are also under development, including canine robots. I don't know if you've seen the videos of those, Ian. Yeah, they're pretty cool. Climbing robots, firefighting robots, surveillance robots, and of course, exoskeletons, which are available now for civilian jobs for heavy lifting and the like, but they're developing them now for soldiers as well.
So for our military aficionados and current members and veterans, we definitely would recommend checking out that link. John shared it on October 11th if you're trying to dumpster dive. It'll also be linked in the show notes, so you can check that out there. Our second topic is, of course, feminism. This is actually something that was on my mind way back at least 6 months ago when I first brought up the idea of doing a podcast, because the question of feminism and what we call the manosphere is a very contentious one and has been in conservative circles from the very beginning. And by conservative, I am going to include the entirety of the American political tradition, because in my view, and in I think Christine's view, conservatism is the attempt to preserve classical liberal principles as enshrined in the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and other founding documents, letters, Federalist Papers, and so forth. And so conservatism in and of itself is meaningless. The conservatism that we in America are talking about is specifically trying to preserve the ideals of liberty and justice for all.
Yes.
So, Christine and I have both thought quite deeply from slightly different perspectives. Of course, I, being a man, don't have a woman's experience, and Christine has. And so that definitely will influence the way that we see these things, and I hope will give some important insights into why conservatism often misses things. Hold on a second. Looks like we've lost... excellent. Why a lot of conservatism, which tends to be heavily dominated by male voices. Now, this is not at all to discount female conservatives. Christine's compiled a really excellent list of some of my favorite female and feminist conservatives. But it is generally a little more male than female. And I think that having this conversation is one of the reasons that I suggested to Christine that we have this podcast, because one of the jobs of editors, this is called the Editor's Pick podcast because we are both editors, and that's our job at the War Elephant, is balancing what is an appropriate post, what is an appropriate perspective on issues of masculinity, femininity, feminism, men's rights, women's rights, and so forth, for our community. So that's why I've titled this topic The Conservative Overton Window. Overton window being the range of appropriateness, the range of appropriate opinions, of opinions that are welcome without being shunned by the majority of the population when they are expressed. And I think that conservatism does need to be a big tent, but there are things that should be outside the bounds. And I think both of those, I think both on the manospheres side, and we will do some definitions of manosphere later in the podcast, and on feminism, which most people have a general understanding of the direction of that. Although I'm thinking that Christine and I will both provide some information on what that means historically and today in terms of specific ideology rather than just being pro-woman, because that's part of the problem with feminism is the looseness of turns and fragmentation of the movement. So I don't want to get too far without just getting into the topic. So Christine, why don't you start us off on some of your thoughts about the history of feminism and what it means to us as conservatives?
Well, first, I would like to clear up a little misunderstanding about what percentage of women identify as conservative as opposed to men. So according to a 2019 poll from Gallup, 41% of men identify as conservative and 36% identify as moderates, for a total of 77% of the American population identifying as conservative or moderate. Now, when you take women, 33% identify as conservative and 35% identify as moderate. That is a 68% identifying as conservative or moderate, which is actually far more women identifying as conservative or moderate in the US general population than most people would actually think. Largely because the media likes to paint broad strokes when they talk about things, just because that number, the base number of men identifying as conservatives, is slightly larger than the base number of women identifying as conservatives. So they make it sound like it's all men.
And this won't be the first time that Christine helps provide some helpful numeracy to the discussion about distribution of men and women in various communities, because that's part of the problem, is that conservatism tends to be very individualistic, whereas liberalism tends to be more comfortable with people as part of, to be charitable, you would call them communities. To be less charitable, you'd call them classes or demographics. So the reason that we brought this up specifically is that I chose to share a piece with Christine's approval that expressed a fairly typical, if perhaps a bit strongly stated position on the differences between men and women. And I thought it was a bit strongly stated, but I think Christine has a bit more of a nuanced pushback on the piece, while still thinking it is within what we consider the Overton window. So the basic premise of the piece is the typical conservative, perhaps even stereotypical conservative position that men and women are generally different, and if left to their own devices without economic constraints or social pressure, they will naturally choose to go into different careers, which lead to things like the difference in overall salaries, because the careers that a stereotypical woman in this view would choose tends to pay less than the careers that a stereotypical man in this case would choose without constraint. So give us some numeracy and understanding of what we're actually looking at here, Christine.
Well, they may choose. They may choose. There is no stereotypical man or stereotypical woman. Right?
Well, that's part of why I'm using those terms, because one of my problems is that I think that relying on these stereotypes is more damaging to relationships between men and women than attempting to be more individualistic would be.
It is. We are all individuals, and if you accept that there are biological differences, which actually I do, we exist on a normal distribution of traits and qualities, and those normal distributions would be between men and women for some characteristics, not all, but for some characteristics, distributed on what's called a bimodal distribution. I should have pulled up a graph so you could share what a bimodal distribution is. But basically, a bimodal distribution would mean there would be two different peaks, and each one would have a bell-shaped curve. And how far apart those two peaks are will vary. And you've probably all seen Democrats versus Republicans, and the bimodal distribution varies over time where they fall. Very similar thing.
I like to call this overlapping bell curves.
Yes.
That might be maybe a more lay term for what we're talking about.
This is where I apologize. I am a chemist. I'm very comfortable with the statistics.
And I am an English major, and I got into that because I didn't want to do more math.
I'm sorry. I like the math.
No, that's why I think this is a great example of what we're talking about. I, being a man, chose to go into a more emotional and liberal
Linguistic?
arts type major. You, being a woman, chose very much to go into a much more concrete and definitely STEM career. And so I think that this is part of what we're talking about. These two bell curves, there are people who generally fit into the peaks of those bell curves where most people fall. They are what we call stereotypical. However, people cross over, and Christine and I both fall within that crossover and are not what you would consider stereotypical men and women, although neither of us would consider ourselves I don't want to speak for Christine, but I've never really questioned myself being a man or wanting to not be a man.
And I'm not gender questioning in the least bit. But I realize I've picked a career, and not only that, but my specialty in my career is way off in the area where there are very few women. Which is in and of itself strange, because what I chose to do is fantastic for women in terms of career choice, because there are very few trade-offs in terms of risks to children. You get great. Okay, so I do stuff with computers. I model stuff as a chemist. You don't have to worry about if you're pregnant. You don't have to worry about not working in the laboratory. You don't have to worry about time off after having kids, because you can work on your computer at home, or you can make alternate childcare arrangements. It's actually one of the most friendly STEM career sort of choices you can make if you were going to have kids. So it's strange to me that very few women pick this particular route, because those trade-offs are something that come into play, and that I'll talk about in terms of this stuff later. So we got this article across our desk, and it talks about men and women making different choices when they have more options. And it was a highly publicized study in a psychology journal where they talked about egalitarian countries having women making more choices. Now, the analysis on it was interesting to me because I thought that they reached their conclusion before they read the article itself, because the article, the journal article, I say the article, the actual scientific paper talked at length about how women in countries with highly developed economic systems have more options and also less fear about losing their opportunities, and so will perhaps make bolder choices or riskier choices economically than those in lower developed nations. And they base their premise of how women choose their careers based on this. And I was willing to go along with that premise. But then I started digging into the data. And I looked at their subset of countries that they'd chosen in order to support their hypothesis. And I came into some interesting findings. One of them was that none of the numbers matched up with what I could find in other sources. So their estimates of the numbers of women going into STEM careers in Sweden, for example, was at least 10% lower than Sweden's estimates of the number going into STEM careers. That is a critical difference. It's very hard to establish what they're doing. Their number of female STEM graduates, they said, in the United States was also at least 10% under what the United States is graduating in STEM fields. And the countries that they chose as having low egalitarian levels in the world had high STEM graduate levels for women, but they left out all kinds of other countries that have very low STEM graduate levels, which I think made for easy data fitting, but was a curious choice, in my opinion, as somebody who's fit an awful lot of straight lines.
So it seems to me that even if the difference between men and women's chosen careers is not as dramatic as the sensationalist commentary about the study implies, that there is still a discrepancy. And I base that on the fact that the UN and feminist organizations are still agitating very strongly to fix the gender gap in these careers.
There is a difference between the men and women, but I don't know that it's linked to egalitarianism in the societies. I don't know that the premise of either the study or this article were correct. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that what you're saying is that there's a very strong possibility that this study, or at least the sensationalized commentary on the study, is confusing correlation with causation, that there are more egalitarian policies, and there is also a greater discrepancy between women choosing careers in STEM, but that there is no link between that correlation, those two correlated phenomena.
Yes, and we will link in our notes the information from the International Labor Organization, where I was looking at different data that led me to say, well, maybe they're cherry picking their data a little bit, which I don't know.
I mean, feminism is such a politicized and monetized, which I think is a really big thing. Getting money and politics into science is never the way to find the truth, in my opinion.
Right now in the United States, 48% of the people in STEM careers are women.
And if you look at slices of age, I think that actually gets much higher. I think that women in educated careers generally, but also in sciences, tend to be very much in these positions in larger percentages as you get younger.
That is correct. And that might actually account for some of the discrepancies in some of the countries as well, by how old the educated population is. In Brazil right now, 47% of the people in STEM careers are women. And that is, to me, quite remarkable. Brazil remains quite a patriarchal society. And yet many women are going into STEM, and so STEM is not seen there as a male-only field. And that raises the suggestion that perhaps STEM isn't universally seen as a male provenance, that competence in STEM is only male. And there are many psychological studies that suggest that both boys and girls are susceptible socially to being told, well, you should be good at this, so they become better at it. It's self-reinforcing. And that's not just STEM, that's many, many skills. Children they pick up on these cues from their parents and from teachers. Whether they're told that they're going to be good at sports, or they're told they're going to be good at music, or they're told they're going to be bad at it. Children pick up on these kind of messages.
And I think that there are some things that the feminist narrative of history ignores some things. And this gets into why there is such a strong perception that conservatism is a male trait and liberalism is a female trait, because of the issue of children and abortion and sexual freedom and sexual consequences. For a society to function, it has to have new people coming into it. And for most societies, that has bring. Now, most of the West has a fairly strongly noticeable population decline among the people who are born in that society, and they are often resorting to influxes of migrant working populations from different countries to increase their population growth. Because unless you believe that humanity should decrease and fall, and I want to be extremely clear about what that means. If your population decreases, your economy will also decrease. People will have less incentive to make things for each other because there won't be as many people to make things for. There won't be as many investments to pay off. Children are an investment. Of course, reducing people to an investment is an extremely narrow and dangerous thing to do, but at the very least, children are an investment. People are an investment, and if there aren't people to invest in for the next generation, a society has chosen to die. And so until the advent of most of our modern technology, it was necessary to structure society in such a way that we would have a lot of new offspring. And that necessarily ties up the people who bear the offspring in a way that disrupts any chance they have at having careers in the more manual labor and careers which do not allow for much interruption, which parenting does require. And I think that while it is a good thing that we have created technologies and careers that allow for advancement of women who choose to have children, or allow women to choose not to have children if they wish, acting as if past societies are by necessity evil for attempting to survive as societies and structuring themselves in such a way that having more children was possible and ensured the most of them survived and grew up to be healthy and educated, I think that is an incredibly narrow and destructive view of history. Christine, maybe you have a different perspective, but this is something I've been thinking about for several years, and I really dislike the trajectory of the feminist narrative of history, which acts as if the only reason that societies were structured in such a way that women had to endure things like coverture, the fact that they couldn't own property if they were married or under the authority of a father, as if the only reason for something like coverture was, in fact, hatred of women. And I think that is an unhelpful view of history.
I think that it is, I think they wind up reducing things to biology too much, to be honest. And also, I don't like calling that just feminism, because feminism has a long history. So if we back up a little bit, there's multiple waves of feminism, and they each view the world quite differently.
And I think that something that we also need to note is that each of the waves that we're going to talk about has subgroups within it.
Oh, yes, very much so. So the first wave of feminism, of course, was suffrage, which was addressing exactly what you were talking about, coverture. It was asking for
and enfranchisement,
and demanding enfranchisement, asking for the right to own property, the right to self-determination, and the right to vote.
And this was roughly in the period following the American Civil War, the 1860s and 70s, all the way up to when enfranchisement happened in the 1920s.
That's correct. And it wasn't limited to just the United States. This was a worldwide political phenomenon.
Yeah.
Although
and Christine was making some very excellent points about how the seeds of feminism were planted in the American Revolution and the founding documents of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams, of course, famously wrote about how these principles of the right of all men, men at the time being understood to include women, and
she said to her husband, John, that if they did not allow women the right to vote, that women were going to rise up and destroy this new union. And she, of course, was a peaceable woman. She was a Quaker.
No, she wasn't a Quaker. She was...
Well...
What was she? There was a specific denomination, but she and her husband were very opposed to the Pennsylvanian Quakers from their more Boston culture, and that was very important in the Constitutional Convention and the choice to go to war.
Her family. She came from, but that was where her family was from. I'm pretty
sure. Anyway, so the seeds were planted way back in significant figures like Abigail Adams, and it proceeded through and was happening somewhat simultaneous to the abolitionist movement. A lot of the abolitionist movement was female-led. Of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, very much part of that whole movement of reform, expanding the franchise, expanding the definition of humanity and equal rights to those who it had not been extended to before. And I think you had a really great Frederick Douglass anecdote to add to that.
He said that it was a real travesty that Black men were gaining civil rights, the right to vote and the right to have property, and Black women were being left behind, and it was no real form of freedom at all for half of all the Black people to be remaining in essential bondage.
And I think that...
So that was... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think that while I certainly agree that, especially in today's society, which is so shaped by feminism and individualism and a much more atomized view of humanity, it is important to note that there were people who opposed expanding franchise to women, not on the grounds of misogyny. Of course, there were largely misogynist reasons for not wanting to exempt. But there were people who did not desire to hate women and thought that the anecdote I always use, and this may or may not work for you, but the anecdote I use is President Lincoln was told by his wife, or perhaps a female letter writer, to grow a beard when he was running for president because it would appeal to women. Women couldn't vote for another 60 years. So why was it important that President Lincoln grow a beard to appeal to women? Because women were still an important part of the vote deciding process through their husbands and family members. And those who argued against expanding the franchise, and this includes people today, the non-feminist or more traditionalist women's movement argues that a more fundamental unit than the individual should be a family structure. And I think that that family structure is prone to perhaps more abuse than an individual-based enfranchisement. But I do think that we should acknowledge that it wasn't a simple case of those who hate women versus those who are in favor of women in the issue of the franchise.
I'm not fond of that line of thinking at all. For one reason,
I'm not saying that you have to agree with it. I just think that it is more complicated than the feminist narrative tends to paint it.
The reason I don't like it is that it highly emphasizes and turns women into manipulative people. And I really don't like that.
Well, that's part of why I said that I think that that model is prone to more abuse than the individualistic model of enfranchisement.
So, and of course, then a woman's voice is entirely dependent on the goodwill of her husband. And that is a very risky place to be when your rights are dependent on the goodwill of another person. And then that is...
Well, just one person. Our rights are always at the goodwill of many people.
Yes.
And the idea of a more democratic society is to reduce the levers which can be used to act upon people to strip them of their rights.
But when your rights are dependent on
just one person, that lever is very powerful.
Yes, it is. It's very, very powerful. So the second wave of feminism, of course, was civil rights.
I actually wanted to mention one more thing about first wave, which is the division between the suffragists and the suffragettes. Suffragists were those who were primarily in the establishment. These included wealthy wives and primarily men who were in favor of expanding the franchise. And they tended to want to move slowly so that they could gain public support. Suffragettes wanted to move much more quickly, and they have won the publicity war. They get the movies made about them because they're the ones who basically committed terrorist acts in bombing and property destruction, as well as the famous case of the woman who deliberately walked in front of the king's horse and was killed. It is a common, but not necessarily universal position among conservative historians that the suffragettes actually hindered the efforts of the suffragists to expand the franchise by somewhere between 10 and 20 years, and that women could have gained the vote earlier if the violence of the suffragettes had not turned public sentiment more against them than they would have if it had been less violent.
And yet they are the ones immortalized.
And I think that's partly because of the Marxist strain of history that idolizes revolution.
And one we see today.
Unfortunately, yes. Let's move to the second wave.
So the second wave of feminism was the civil rights movement, which dealt with a wide number of issues, mostly having to do with equal access to jobs, to healthcare, to birth control, to abortion. I'm going to separate abortion out from birth control. To divorce rights. That did lag quite a bit. And it does bear noting because this plays into the Manosphere now. Because for a long time, divorce was actually in the province of men. and women could not initiate divorce in many places. And so the cards were completely stacked against women. And so civil rights was a huge movement that followed, that went all the way up into the 1970s. And that was a big deal. My mother actually was impacted by that. When she was working in the 1970s, she was making less than 40% of what her male coworkers at the same job made. And that was a factory position where they were working the same factory floor equipment in a plastics molding job. It kind of seems incredible today, to be honest, because you go into a job and it's something young women today take completely for granted. I know I do. I really do. That I take for granted. If I go in and apply for a job somewhere, I'll be offered the same wage or the same starting negotiation position as another person, regardless of gender. And that's the way it is. But it wasn't that way in the 1970s. And we can thank second wave feminism for that. And they did the same thing to people of color as well. So the civil rights movement did make a big difference in terms of equality.
And it also led, and so the civil rights movement, of course, peaked in the 60s, but of course it was going all the way through things like the military integration and military manufacture, with women working in factories in World War II and Black men serving in the military, of course, most famously the Tuskegee Airmen, but all across the war, there were, of course, non-white soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers, and there were a lot of discrimination, but the simple bringing together of people and seeing each other in those hard circumstances was a big part of the civil rights movement, and spilled over, of course, into the 60s, 15 to 20 years later. In the 80s and 90s, we had the rise of what was called third wave feminism.
And third wave feminism was all over the board originally. So you saw like ecofeminism and vegan feminism, and you saw punk riot girl feminism, and nobody really knew quite what to make of this. But amid all of this chaos, something new emerged, and that was Kimberly Crenshaw,
who was a lawyer, wasn't she?
Yes. And she brought Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack and Intersectionality. And Intersectionality brought third wave feminism with postmodernism, activism as a lifestyle, queer theory, sex positivity. It all came together into something that coalesced into a new movement of feminism. And that's really what people think about today when they think about feminism. They're no longer thinking about access to a birth control pill, because quite frankly, everybody has access to the birth control pill. You can log on to your phone and see a doctor on a video chat, or go down to the nearest public clinic, or go to your family doctor and get a prescription for a birth control pill, and then you can go to Walmart and it's $10 for birth control. Actually, no, it's free because of the plan. It's free because of the Affordable Care Act. But before the Affordable Care Act, it was $10. Is that
true? So what you just said is definitely true for those who have access to a physician. But what about people who don't, women, let's say specifically women who specifically don't have the training or understanding of primary care providers? Those who, for financial, or a lot of women in poor communities just don't get trained to go to doctors or ask doctors. Is it possible to get birth control without a prescription?
No, you need a prescription because it is altering your hormones. So
Right.
there are medical consequences to taking your birth control. So, but you can go to Planned Parenthood, you can go to any clinic, and there are sliding fees, and it is if you don't, it's all income based. And there are in cities, they run clinics inside malls, and strip malls, and they're all over the place. So it's really not that hard. The bigger barrier is people's reticence to get birth control in the first place, like for cultural reasons, unwillingness to admit that they are doing things, or embarrassment that somebody might find out is a much bigger barrier to access than cost usually at this point, because there are so many programs to help pay for your health care.
We also recently, in the last, I would say 5 years, have the rise of what we may consider in 10 years' time the fourth wave of feminism, this very powerful blend of the third wave theories into what some have called woke culture, what you could call critical theory culture. And critical theory, of course, goes back to the beginning of third wave and even into some of the second wave, but it really gained dominance in the last 5 years in popular culture, whereas it gained dominance in the academy in the 80s and 90s. So it's kind of a story of these philosophies marching their way from the elite down to the widespread masses through popular media and education. We're getting a bit further on time than I thought we would, so I'm going to move us on to the Manosphere. We have a bit more information linked in our show, well, not linked, but posted in our show notes, including that list of conservative feminists.
Well, before you do, let me note that it's because of this third and now what is considered possibly fourth wave feminism that makes feminism controversial. So about 56% of Republican women think that feminism is empowering, which is a lot more than you would think so. 77% of Democratic women, according to Pew Research, say it's empowering. But 37% of Democratic women believe feminism is polarizing. And 43% of Republican women believe it's polarizing. I think those numbers are actually pretty close to each other. They're not hugely apart. And it is that third and fourth wave feminism. It is the intersectionality and the critical theory that really polarize people. It's not the civil rights. It's not the suffrage, the equality under the law. A lot of conservative women consider themselves feminists, and they do so under that first and second wave definitions. It is among Republican-leaning women, 42% of Republican-leaning women consider themselves feminists. And by doing so, they really consider themselves equality feminists. That is, equality of men and women.
In value and capability.
Yes.
So, as a response to, there's always been a backlash to feminism, all the way back to the first wave. I've already tried to give some of the what I would consider at least trying to be non-misogynist attempts, but there were definitely misogynist attempts. And I think that in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of what's called the Manosphere as a home for some of this, at the very least, very aggressive response to feminism. And I think even those who would consider themselves part of the Manosphere on the moderate and attempting to be virtuous end of that sphere would say that there is a large number of people who actively just hate women in this Manosphere. Now, I think the Manosphere has largely evaporated as any kind of concentrated movement. The biggest period of the Manosphere, I would say, was probably from about 2010 to 2018. In my view, President Trump's support movement, whether you call it MAGA or you call it the populist right has mostly eaten the Manosphere's energy, that they've poured themselves into that rather than focusing on male issues such as things like the disposable male and men's rights in a divorce case and child parental rights, which are their stereotypical issues. All of these things do have legitimate reasons to be concerned about. There's a reporter on the Daily Wire, Ash Short, who spent the last 6 or 7 years reporting on the dangers that a particular theory of feminist approach to sexual assault and rape causes to men in the Believe Women movement, rather than the listen to women but verify claims before inflicting punishment, especially on campuses of higher education. So I definitely don't want to say that there aren't legitimate complaints, but I also think that the reason I titled this The Conservative Overton Window is because I think the large majority of the manosphere is outside the bounds of what we should consider conservative and belongs more in the place of alt-right or extreme right, because it does hate women. And if you don't believe that it hates women, check out some of the right-leaning YouTuber women. Lauren Southern, of course, is a big example, but you could also look at one of my favorites, Poe the Person, who's a British engineer. And when they talk about women's issues and they veer from the manosphere's accepted orthodoxy or accepted list of topics, the abuse they hurl at these young women is stunningly inappropriate and vicious and evil. So that's why I want to draw a very firm line. If your position is attempting to acknowledge the equal value and worth of women and men together, even if you believe that they have very different giftings in general, whether you think those are biologically based or culturally based, I think that would be acceptable in the conservative Overton window. If that turns into abuse, derogatory comments about someone based on the fact that they are a woman, that is right out of bounds. That is not an acceptable position in conservatives. Definitely not acceptable in the war elephant, and I would argue isn't a conservative position at all.
Well, and if you're reaching the point where you're saying men shouldn't get married or have children or families and women are evil, you're basically the mirror image of radical feminists. Congratulations.
And that is not a hypothesis. There's an entire movement that named itself MGTOW, men going their own way, that view women as parasites, sapping men's energy. And a lot of these are divorced men who have been very brutally financially treated in divorces. And I think Christine would agree. Oftentimes a divorce is very much a dehumanizing process for men to go through. But that doesn't
they don't realize it's dehumanizing for everyone. Divorce is one of those terrible things where everybody but the lawyer loses. And I wish that's something people, when they got married, knew going into marriage. If you get divorced, you are going to lose. You and your partner and your children, if you have any, are all going to lose. And so divorce is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And sometimes it is necessary.
Absolutely. But I think one of the things that conservatives, especially the conservative Christian population, is very susceptible to is because we believe that marriage is a spiritual thing and should be broken only as a last resort. There's more pressure to stay in an abusive marriage than I think there should be. And yes. I think that abusive marriages, divorce is absolutely advisable. That being said, being advisable and being the better option doesn't mean it's not going to be brutal and devastating and dehumanizing. And we need to acknowledge that and support divorced people.
Yeah, but you will come out, and usually they come out emotionally. Everyone who goes through divorce comes out emotionally battered, and because it's a living death. You had a death of a relationship, and it was a real living thing, and the person that you loved is walking around and alive. It's terrible, terrible grief. And then if you think about it this way, and this is something very few divorced people think about rationally, you had 100% of everything that you shared. It was all yours. I mean, it was both of yours, but it was all yours. Now you get divorced and you split everything up. Assuming you split it up perfectly evenly, you now have half of what you had, but you had lawyers and they took, 10 or 20% of everything. So suppose you had cheap lawyers and they took 10% of everything. Now you had 90% divide between each of you. You each have 40% of what you had before. Both parties feel very aggrieved. And like the other one got everything. That's in the best case scenario. On top of all the broken heart and hurt feelings. So financially, everybody loses in divorce. And the way I see it is a lot of these very bitter feelings that come out. And if there's any inequity, like one partner kept the house, which somebody keeps physical custody of the house, unless it gets sold and divided off. And then usually it's whoever has the kids. And quite often the partner who spent most times with the kids keeps the kids. That's how most, even if there's shared custody arrangements, quite often whoever has had most of the time with the kids will stay in residence in the house, and they'll figure out how to divide assets up. But it will feel unjust, no matter how fair the court tries to be. It will feel horribly unjust. And that leads to resentment.
And out of that stew of injustice and pain and death always comes bitterness. Right. And so this is all to say that I do understand why these movements exist. But again, if that spills out into acting like a whole group of humans is evil because of their sexual organs, that's not conservative, that's not moral, it's not virtuous. And that's not within the Overton window of conservative philosophy and thought, especially not at the War Elephant.
No, and we don't endorse it from the other direction, like either direction. I'm trying very hard here to use gender-neutral language because I actually know a lot of situations with divorces where it goes both directions.
Yep.
People.
Well, I don't want to get too bogged down in the specifics of divorce, just because that's
right.
very specifically
that's where
tied
it comes
to
from.
MGTOW.
That's where it comes from, and actually, it's interesting that feminism and Menonism, I think is what they call it.
It's gone through a lot of different ways.
Interesting mirror images of each other. And right now they have so much narrative telling that comes out of that same mindset of postmodernism.
And I think it's not an accident that if you look at the current dominant fight, which is race, white people versus non-white people, primarily black, but also non-black people, we see the exact same thing. We see the far progressive left through people like Robin DiAngelo claiming that white people are, by being white in a majority white culture, evil. And then you see the alt-right and even portions of, I would argue, President Trump's support, who view people who are not white, whether they're immigrants or poor people who predominantly tend to be in the black community, but also the Hispanic community, as being evil because they're taking our jobs, they're taking our livelihood, they're taking our space, they're bringing down property values, they're causing crime. It's all this grouping of people together in clumps of things that they can't do anything about, whether it's being a man, being a woman, being non-white, being white, and saying that that person is evil because of the thing they can't change about themselves. You're born with those things, you can't change them, and you're evil because of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that whether it comes from the right or the left, it is evil, and it should not be given a foothold in an honest liberal or an honest conservative's philosophy. And one of the reasons that we exist at War Elephant is we want to provide a space for people to explore the boundaries, explore the different ideas, because I personally believe there is no perfect solution to the problems that drive these divisions. We will always have conflicts. We will always have economic inequality. As a Christian, I believe that when Jesus said the poor will always be with you, he meant that the poor will always be with us. We'll never get rid of poverty. That doesn't mean, I think, that we shouldn't make poor people's lives as good as we can. We should never not care about them. We should never not care about those who are different than us. But I think that it means that we always have to be struggling, and we'll find different answers for different circumstances. Sometimes those will be on the more liberal side of the spectrum. Sometimes, I think more often, those will be on the conservative side of the spectrum. But I don't think we should try and get rid of the liberal side. But when the liberal side, as I think is true right now, is taken over by an ideology that is condemning an entire group of people for something they cannot change about themselves, I think we need to fight that on the left. And just as much, we need to fight it on the right, in the form of the alt-right and the race realists, or whatever they're calling themselves. Anyone who believes that someone is evil because of a characteristic they cannot change about themselves should not be allowed to have a leadership position.
I agree. I agree with that, Ian, 100%.
So this was a very...
That's a hard line in the sand.
It is. And that is why I had this as the conservative Overton window. I want us to have an open discussion, different points of view. Christine didn't agree with the post that I approved. I don't completely agree with it, but I think that we need to publish different things so we can get the conversation going. And respond to it with thought, as Christine did.
And as editors, we don't always agree with posts that go up. We have editorial standards. One of those standards is not, do I agree with it? No. Our standards are based on writing, consistency, citation, respectfulness. And do they fit within the conservative Overton window? Not our personal feelings.
And hopefully, even though this is a very thorny discussion and we can't come to any really strong conclusions because the conversation's still going on, and will always be going on because there's always going to be men and women. Hopefully, we've given you some ideas of how to make a determination whether a school of thought or a person you're talking to is espousing an idea that fits within the conservative Overton window or is beyond the bounds. Has drifted too far either to the left or the right. Hopefully we've given you some principles and the idea that if you find yourself treating an entire group of people as evil or lesser because of something they cannot change about themselves, being a man or a woman, that is beyond the bounds. This is not the same as thinking that people are different based on those immutable characteristics, because they are. Christine and I both believe in that double bell curve, so people are going to have overlap, but we're still different. We're not the same. And I think that is a key thing on the far left that is being eroded.
And as always, you have to adhere to being able to be respectful of
the 3 R's: respectful, researched, and relaxed.
And to be able to see each other as people.
So, with that being said, tomorrow is election day. If you're watching this after the election, hopefully you're in a better place than we are. But please, go out and vote. I myself have still not decided who I want to vote for. If you've already voted, good for you. But do vote. It is part of one of the immeasurable blessings and privileges we have as Americans to be involved in the democratic process, especially on the local level, which I would encourage you to look into. And if you vote differently than me, I really do hope you vote.
I'll be voting. I'll be voting tomorrow, and the only thing I've decided for certain is I'm probably not writing in Cookie Monster, although it was his birthday today and it was tempting.
Cookies are pretty great, and I'd vote for more of them. But I feel like a lot of people tell you to vote, but they really just want you to vote for that person. I mean it. If you want to vote for the Democrat or the Republican.
Or the Libertarian. I hear that Joe Jorgensen's running too. I'm not plugging
Or if you want to write someone
saying.
in. I know a lot of people who are going to write people in. Do that. I think it's good. And we'll see you next week, hopefully in a better place. I don't guarantee it, and I personally am not necessarily convinced, but I will work to make it a better place with Christine, and I hope to see you next time.